Cho, hey, Rio here. It is week 10. I know, it is crazy that it's week 10, but it is week 10. And I just finished the last video for our code discussion, and I finished the instruction for the step 2, and I wrote my step 2. And I'm not going to go over the level of detail I did for step 1 because the idea is that I'm trying to get you to write some code without, because we've already written code like this, but you're also taking your decision process and figuring out how to write functions and return values. And this is something I cover a bit this week, especially at the last part of revisiting functions. And I do some cleanup, honestly, after doing the form validation from last week, because I spent a couple days away from it, and when I looked at it again, I didn't like the way it looked, which is very common. All right, so for week 10, attendance. Right, I'm going to go over kind of like what I did last week for the attendance post. Like I'm going to go over step 2 for our decision app. And again, maybe you already have the form validation from that week. And again, these are great places to ask questions if you have any. So here's my output for my code. Okay, I'm just going to show you the output. And this probably may remind you of when we were doing, because it is very similar in the sense of, we're updating the page. Here's the title of my app, the daily activity decider. And then with a sleep score of 80, and it is Monday, you should do a recovery walk. With a sleep score of 90 and it's Friday, you should do a VO2 max run. Now, of course, the data is not the same as our carbon footprint, but the idea of just outputting that decisions, and in this case these are decision strings, and I'll talk about that in a minute. And then I also have one that decision cannot be made based on your inputs, so no data will be stored. Okay, so let's go look at the instruction now that we've seen that, and let's go look at the step 2. So one thing I did give some thought to this week was, I had said last week I was going to have you create branches, but I changed my mind because what I realized is if we create a branch in our private repos, it actually creates it, and branches are great because branches, just FYI, in terms of how we use them in Git, is like if you're working by yourself or more likely with a team and you're asked to implement a new feature into the software, you would take the existing code base, create a branch, start coding in that branch, not touching maybe production, maybe not, right? And then when that code has been checked out probably by somebody else, tested, and it's been signed off, then you merge that back into the main branch. What I wasn't going to do it that way. I was going to have you for each step create a new branch, but I realized it wouldn't work very well because what would happen is it would duplicate the entire structure that we've created, and that could get confusing, and that's not the intention. So what I landed on was just having a folder for step 1 and step 2, and the reason I want that is I want to be able to go back and look at your step 1 and your step 2. So basically you're going to take what was in from week 1, the index, the main, and the readme file, create a new folder called step 1, copy that in there, create a new folder called step 2, and then copy that same code as your starting code for step 2. Okay? By the way, here's my setup, right? So that's what I originally had, and here's my code that I wrote. And I'm just at least going to give you the outline of what I did. Okay, so you're going to write at least 2 named functions. Named functions are what we talked about, where we actually gave it a name. And down here I talk about you can either write traditional, what we've been writing, or you can write arrow functions. Either are fine, as long as you name them. Okay. So the idea here is that you're taking those global variables you created in step 1, and they will become arguments passed into the functions now as parameters. Now, exactly how you implement that will be different for each student's decision-making process and how they want to set up their functions, but you need to have at least 2 functions. I think I ended up with, well, I'll show you in a minute. Now, your functions need to have return values. We covered that this week. So it's a good refresher to have, I think. And we do some other things with functions this week. Nothing that you have to implement here, but if you wanted to, I ended up using the default value because my BMR was not the way I was calculating it was not working. So I ended up, I think you'll be able to see that. And now in this case, your functions need to have return values that you will use to create a data structure with both the inputs and the decision values. Okay? Now, I give you a choice here. Okay? You can either just create a string, right, that has all that data in it. Okay? Or you can create an array if arrays are more comfortable, or you can create an object. Or if you're, which you can also create an array of objects. Now, I ended up using objects because I thought it was a good step to actually remind, it's like, okay, objects, what are objects, right? But next week, we will implement an array of objects. So whichever one you want to do this week is fine, right? Make sure you call your function several times. Remember, what you're doing there is you're calling it enough times to check all the branches in your logic to make sure they work as intended, right? And then you display the decision on the index page, okay? So for me, if I move over to my decision code, I set up a global for decision out, which is a div that I placed on my index. I have a function called create hit object. I have another function called create run object. I have an update DOM. And then I have make exercise suggestion. And in this case, I call make exercise suggestion. I pass in the day and my sleep score. So current day and sleep score. And then the logic inside of here is, again, this is where getting help, because here's my hesitation is that, this is part of the work. This is actually the majority of the work that you're doing this week is figuring out how to implement your functions. So I can just tell you this make exercise function does a logic. It does a logic check to see what the day is, and then based on that it calls one or the other function. It returns an object that I then update with some values based on current day and sleep score, because here's my inputs, right? I do a calculation, right? And by the way, you can also see, I'll be happy to show you this, here's my returned object. So my BMR, because if you remember from last week, if it's a recovery day, I'm going to have less calories per day. But I'm capturing my calculated value. I'm capturing the current day, one of my inputs. I'm capturing the type of exercise and my sleep score. Okay? Now, in this case, I outputted a string, and I referenced the values in the object to create the string that I passed to update DOM. Okay? For these two, and then I did have one of my calls that I knew would not suggest, so that I knew in that case that the inputs wouldn't create an object. So that's how I approached it, and I show you that just to give you some ideas. And knowing what the object looks like, again, you don't have to do the objects this week. You could just output something to the string, but you need to have that string contain the inputs. Remember, the inputs are these, right? The decision, in this case, is the object that I created. You can use an array, you can use an object, you can use a string, you can use an array of objects. I used an object that I then created a string from that object references those particular values. I passed that to another function. Again, you only had to have, in this case, at minimum 2 You may end up with more. I think a few more would probably not be a bad idea because you could have one for output. So this make suggestion is kind of like our old start when I had the start function, right? That kind of organizes everything. And in this case, what's I think great is I only have one global variable. So the idea here is to minimize the number of global variables. Okay. All right. So that's what you're going to do. But not until we do some code along, we learn a little more, right? Revisit functions. We're going to talk about, first we're going to do a little tidying up, which I hope you appreciate. I revisit the conversation about functions. I actually have you refactor all of our functions into named functions where we declare them. You'll get that in this experience. Right? And then actually I realized I'd made a mistake on one, and I talked about that on the next video here. I've also, I think I might be missing, actually I think I got to check this, I think I'm missing a video here. So then, and I realized in the video I was calling it a spread. Anyway, I correct that here. And then we revisit at the end. I go over the idea of functions. And I add to that a couple of new terms, right? We add a default value, which is something I'll have you do in the code challenge. We'll do the spread operator. I'll talk about that. And then in the discussion this week, in the code challenge discussion, I'll have you rewrite our functions now to be arrow functions, which is relatively straightforward. I hope. And then you'll also find somewhere to implement the default value and the spread operator. And then of course on to here, right? So these are the first two items like we did last week. I think this is the pattern we'll see. Sorry for here. And then next week is when our code review opens, and I'll talk about that because I'm going to have to think about how we're going to do that, because the opening for signups here, the code reviews wouldn't actually start until the week after, okay? Because I'd want you to get all the way through that week before you couldn't actually before this would be an option. All right, I think that's my next thing I got to think about, and I look forward to that. I hope you have a great week. Hope you're doing well. I'll talk to you soon.